Would some honourable member care to move that the House take note of miscellaneous business? Order. Is there a point of order? I apologise to Matulia Ture. Point of order, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, without wanting to relitigate an answer you gave earlier, it does raise a constitutional question, or something that might come up as a constitutional question. When, as Mr Brownlee said, government is not enduring, if a ministerial portfolio has been disestablished and yet there have been actions taken under that portfolio, decisions made for which the government of the day took responsibility, surely the Crown has an ongoing responsibility, and ministers who are appointed by the Crown inherit those responsibilities as each new government comes in. So I'm wondering, sir, whether you could give some thought to the process that might be undertaken if the situation arises in the future where a portfolio under a previous government has been disestablished, yet there are matters pertaining to it which come up under a subsequent government, that there be some method by which the Crown addresses that through ministerial responsibility.
Well, I'll hear from the Honourable Trevor Mills.
I have seen some precedent for this in the past, and the questions have gone to the Prime Minister if no one else is clearly responsible.
I'll hear from the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, Mr Speaker, I think there are two questions here. One is, if it is a change of ministerial portfolio or name and some additional responsibilities inside the term of a current government, that would be one matter. But if it is to be, as Mr Prosser is, I think, suggesting, that we would look across actions taken in a ministerial portfolio by previous governments that may not, that no longer are in authority, then that would be quite a different matter. For example, Mr Speaker, it would be just completely inappropriate to look back in history and start asking questions about the activities of the titular position Treasurer.
The Honourable... Order. Order. I'm dealing with a point of order. The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, sir. Speaking to the point raised by Mr Brownlee, which was not the one that was raised by Mr Prosser, I don't think that is correct, and I think that there are Speaker's rulings, and if there aren't, there should be, that a government is responsible for its actions, including in periods prior to the last election. Otherwise, a government at the day after election could refuse to answer questions for their conduct the day before an election.
No, my next point of order was to the Right Honourable Winston.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, you were listening to a point of order, and then the person making it out, or speaking to it, namely Mr Brownlee, decided to insult someone here. And frankly, I don't see why we should have to listen to a drongoistic woodworking teacher.
Member will resume his seat immediately. There was no insult given that I saw or heard. The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, the flaw with Mr Parker's argument is that governments change. So under an MMP system, no consecutive government consecutive governments are unlikely to look the same as they did previously. Now, so I think that does pose some an interesting question for you to consider over a period of time, but I think it would be unfortunate if the conclusion was that the look back in ministerial responsibility could go beyond the term of any particularly elected government, in other words, the 3 years.
In answer to Mr Prosser's point, I will give the matter further thought because I think it is interesting, and having gone through both Speaker's rulings and standing orders prior to question time, anticipating there may be points of orders raised, to be honest, I think, particularly Speaker's rulings, there's not a lot of previous rulings about this. I think the point raised by the Honourable Trevor Mallard is helpful to us, and it was mentioned in one of the responses I gave to Mr Parker. I think a good way forward for Mr Parker's situation is to consider questions now to the Minister for Innovation, Business and Employment or to the Prime Minister. But once a particular portfolio is folded, if there's any fiscal attachments to it, that budget would still be able to be tracked back through an alternative minister. I will give further thought to it. It is an interesting question that has been raised, and it may require an adjustment both to either standing orders or to Speaker's rulings. So we interrupted. So I call on the Materia Ture
Thank you,
for
Mr.
the general
Speaker.
debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This national government is dozing and denying. Dozing and denying. Look at them. They're basically asleep. Look at that. They're sleeping on the job on the most important issues that face this nation. Dozing and denying. This government is asleep at the wheel. And what are they doing? They are driving families up against the wall. Families living in cars, Mr. Speaker. Kids who are sick in hospital with avoidable diseases, waterways polluted, and the economy designed to make the rich richer, Mr. Woodhouse. That's national. That's what National has made of our beautiful country, Aotearoa, New Zealand. They certainly talk big. There's no doubt that National talks big, but, sir, they do bugger all. They spin the facts.
Order.
They spin the facts, yes, Mr. Speaker. They deny the reality of pollution and they rehash old social policy because they have no new ideas. They turn their gaze away from the families who need them the most. Shameful, short-sighted, and an indictment on the Prime Minister and all of those who are in his cabinet. Far, sir, from governing for all New Zealanders, the Prime Minister and his government are content to leave 150,000 children without the basics that they need to live a decent life. This government is content with 40% of New Zealand families, 40% of New Zealand families sharing just 3% of the nation's wealth between them. Satisfied with the chronic lung infections for children that's at 7 times the rate of the OECD average. Happy to leave 50% of Pacifica children living in overcrowded homes and ignorant of the growing rates of homelessness that is infecting our country. So much for the brighter future that National promised New Zealand. This national government is entrenching hardship and insecurity. They have policies that make children sick, that leave New Zealanders living on the street, dozing and denying while ordinary New Zealanders suffer the effects. They don't suffer the effects. They are part of the top 10% who are doing quite well under this government. The rest of New Zealand are the ones who are suffering. And, sir, we heard today, of course, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment and her scathing report and her criticism of government over the health of our environment. She has rightly criticised the government for not providing New Zealanders with real information about how our natural environment is doing. National repeatedly cut funding to conservation, and that means we are losing the fight to protect the kea, to protect the kiwi and the peka and all of those, the natural environments and those native species, iconic native wildlife, the birds, the bush, the rivers, all of these things which are our children's birthright, Mr. Speaker. National is squandering our children's birthright. National has shown it is far more interested in spinning stories about New Zealand's clean green image rather than facing up to the reality of unswimmable rivers, declining native bird populations and the major effects of climate change that are hurting farmers, hurting our communities and concerning coastal communities. This government out of touch, uncaring, dozing and denying. Sir, we must create a more equal, inclusive society in this country. Protecting our environment is fundamental to our future, and that is why we must change the government. New Zealand deserves a Prime Minister and a government who will build homes for New Zealand families, cut climate emissions and protect our environment, and that will end child poverty in this country. So New Zealanders are compassionate, responsible and trustworthy, and New Zealanders deserve a government who is the same. We will change the government, and the Green Party intends to deliver that new government to this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable